So we're on Daf Kuf Beis, Amid Beis, and we got up to Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav, which you'll see approximately, I would say, close to 15 lines down from the top of Kuf Beis, Amid Beis. It's almost parallel to Tosfos Divrei HaMaskil Mai. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. Now, let me just mention the last thing that we discussed a week ago, and that is the question of kavana, of intention. And we discussed a case where we're not sure if she had intention for chalitza. And because of that suffix, we went l'chumra on two counts. Number one, the chalitza would not allow her to marry anyone from the shuk because we don't know it's a valid chalitza. We're not sure if she had kavana. And number two, on the other hand, l'chumra, the chalitza would generate an iser, what's called chalutza, on the other brothers. So she cannot have yibum with any of the other brothers. She'll need a repeat chalitza from that particular brother that she was cholitz. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav, sandal hatafur b'pishtan, which means that in this case, instead of using R, which is leather, to put together the sandal, they used pishtan. And this was called tfira. Tfira means sewing. And they used linen to sew together the sandal. And that's called tfiros hamamidos es hasandal. The sandal, without these linen threads that was sewn in, would simply fall apart. Ein cholzimbo, it's a no-no. A chalitza shoe has to be 100% leather. Shenemar, we're going to derive this from a pasuk, and the pasuk you'll see is from Yechezkel, and it says, "Ve'analech tachash." Now, tachash is an animal, a very unique kind of animal. It's actually got a hide that's very unique. It's multicolored, and it was used as a covering for the Mishkan, tachash. And for some of the other clay shares that they used in the Mishkan that they carried from place to place, they were covered with tachash. Now, this pasuk that we're studying now indicates that when we talk about a na'al, because the pasuk speaks about ve'an alech, which is miloshen na'al, tachash means the hides of an animal called the tachash. So this is leather. This is a hide of an animal. And therefore, na'al is associated with and defined by animal hides. So the Gemara objects. The ema, perhaps, when this pasuk says "Venolech tachash," that's tachash in midi achrini lo. Maybe we should go to an extreme. And based on this pasuk in Yechezkel, we should derive the conclusion that the only hides or leather that we can use for a nal shel chalitza is made of tachash. Nothing but tachash would do. If you have other hides from other animals, they would not be kosher for chalitza because they are not called tachash. And we know that that's not true. So we're in a kind of a bind here because on the one hand, you're excluding tfira of pishtan based on this pasuk in Yechezkel. But if you apply this pasuk in Yechezkel to its logical conclusion, then you should come to the conclusion that nothing but tachash can be used for a nal shel chalitza. So the Gemara says, Na'al riba. The pasuk repeats the word Na'al a second time. And that indicates that there are many different types or categories of Na'al. So the Gemara says, wait a second. If you're telling me there are many different types of Na'al, then maybe I don't even need leather at all. Na'al riba. If this word Na'al appears multiple times, and that's called a ribui, it's coming to include maybe all types of oros. And you don't have to limit yourself to or at all. I feel called mili nami, maybe even something that is not made of or, like, for example, let's say you took cloth, like some of our slippers. I don't know if anyone here wears cloth slippers, but you have cloth slippers. Those are not aligned, but they're made of cotton, which is bad. Is afilu called mili nami? So the Gemara answers, in kain tachash my ahanile. So why did the Torah have to indicate tachash? So on the one hand, the Torah says tachash as if to say it has to be tachash. On the other hand, the Torah says nal riba to include all kinds of oros. So how do I reconcile these two extremes? I have to come up with a compromise shita, and that is that from the pasuk analech tachash, we're going to derive that you need some sort of the hide of an animal. On the other hand, from the word now, we're going to tell you that you don't need a hide of a tachash, but a hide of any animal is kosher for chalitza. And that's the ribui of the pasuk. Now, I have a note here that I wanted to share with you. I'm just looking for it now. 1 second, where is it? Okay. This actually, we're going to get to a little bit later on. This note is relevant to a sugya on Daf Kuf Gimel about a case of a wooden shoe. And it was covered with hide, with leather. So the shoe itself is made of wood, but it's covered with leather. Rabbi Eliezer asked Rav the following question: who shall or? It means that the shoe itself is made of leather, but Traciosav, which are what's the word I want to use? The laces that you use to tie the shoes are made of seyar. They are made of the hairs of a goat, of goat hairs. Mahu. Do we derive from Venalech that even the shoelaces have to be made of or is it enough that the shoe itself is made of or and the shoelace by which I tie it, that's secondary. That's irrelevant. Amalei. Now we have the response of Rav to Rabbi Elazar. Milo Karina Bey Venalech Tachash. Isn't it so that the laces that you use to tie it up, they are also part and parcel of the shoe, and they should also be included in that description of a nal of tachash. But Rashi here interprets it differently. Rashi says that what Rav was responding to Rabbi Eliezer is that Ve'enolech tachash is coming to include anything that comes from an animal. And that means that if you take the hairs from an animal and you make laces out of them to tie your shoes, that's also considered venolech tachash. So we're expanding the definition of tachash to include any animal, and we're expanding the definition of nal to include the laces that tie the shoe onto the foot. But just like the nal itself is made from the product of an animal, in this case, the hides of an animal, the laces could be made from a product of an animal, in this case, the hairs of the animal. So the Gemara is not happy with this. Ihachi, if you're going to tell me that anything that comes from the animal is included under tachash and therefore is a nal, then kulo sel seir nami. Why not make the entire shoe out of goat hairs? Again, it'll be more like a slipper than a shoe. Maybe very comfortable in the summertime, but and the Gemara answers, Hahu kurka mikri. Now, what does kurka mikri mean? I'll read to you the Hebrew translation. He says, Heyos shek shemedabkim hanotzos. Notzos are these hairs or feathers that come from the goat. And when they attach them, and osameam sandal, when they make a sandal out of goat hairs or goat feathers, hasandal yotze ava. It becomes very thick. You know, when you have leather, you can thin down the leather by tanning it. The yeshlo shem b'znei atzmo and nikra kurka. Now let's understand. When we try to define a term and figure what is included and can be subsumed under that term, we're very sensitive to language. And if something has a different name, then that indicates that it's not a subcategory of that which has the other name. So let's say, for example, you could talk about a shoe, a nal. Then you could talk about something called a kurka. A kurka is a sandal that's made out of the hairs of an animal. It's not called a nal. And since the Torah requires a nal, the cholatz nalo me'olo, a kurka has its own name, and therefore it's in a separate category. In fact, I'll tell you a secret. Sometimes the Gemara has something called Shem Levi, that even if it does have the same name, but we add another descriptive word to the title, like let's say, for example, you have Hadassim, and then there was special Hadassim that was very different, that came from Mitzrayim. They were imported into Palestine from Egypt. And they were called Hadas HaMitzri. And the Gemara thinks that if they're called Hadas HaMitzri, that's not called Hadas. In this case, it's not even called a nal. It's called a kurka. And he says the following. If you ask me, what is the law of a shoe when the shoe itself is made of leather, but the straps and the laces are made of hair, then if you're going to apply the principle of an olech tachash, that anything that grows from an animal, then you could have footwear that's made exclusively of hairs of an animal. And the Gemara answers, no, that footwear is called karka and not a shoe. It doesn't have the name shoe. He says in the footnote that it's made from two pieces of leather that's glued together. I didn't see that. In my Gemara, it says midabkin notzos. It doesn't say anything about leather. So, Rabos, I think we should go into business and we should be selling Erev Yom Kippur. We should open up a kurka shop because I think you could wear a kurka on Yom Kippur. It's not a now. And on Yom Kippur, one of the 5 categories of the Isser, of the Inui, is called Milas HaSandal, but this is not called a sandal, it's called a kurka. Amalei Rav Kahana L'Shmuel. Mimai dahai v'cholza nalo me'al raglo. The Torah describes the act of chalitza with those 4 words. V'cholza nalo me'al raglo. Mishlafu. She draws the shoe off his foot. Him meaning the Yavam. Tichsiv, because it says in the Parsha Beis HaMenuga, which means the house that is contaminated with Nigei Batim, Vechiltu es havanim asher ba'en haneged. We have to remove from the walls of the house those stones, bricks, that are contaminated. You see clearly that Bechiltu means mishlaf, to remove. Just like we remove the stones that have been contaminated with tumas batim under the pasuk Bechiltu es havanim, so too, when it says here in chalitza v'cholza nalo me'araglo, it means that she pulls off his shoe. The ema zruzehu. I'm going to prove to you that the word vechiltu has a totally different meaning. It does not mean to pull something off. Who remembers when we were young, they used to talk about the original settlers of the land of Palestine, the land of Israel. They called them what? Do you remember? Chalutzim. I didn't hear you give me the answer, but I can't hear anything from you. So, hichaltu me'itchem anoshim latzava. When the people of Israel went to battle against Midian after that whole fiasco with the Benos Moab, etc. So Moshe Rabbeinu was told, hichaltu me'itchem anoshim latzava. Hecholtu, it means get them excited, activate them. In Hebrew, it's called lizarzam, zirus. Now, honestly, what I can't figure out is what would that mean in the context of the cholza nalo me'al raglo? What could it possibly mean? And I think the answer is that the Gemara means to raise the possibility that instead of the Yavama removing the shoe of the Yavam, the opposite. She should be putting the shoe on the foot of the Yavam. Because Hicholzu means get ready to go, to move forward in the military campaign. Put your shoes on. Taking off your shoes would be the exact opposite of Hicholzu. So the Gemara says, Hasam Nami, what does it mean? Hicholzu mi'itchem anoshim litzava, shilufe mi besa likrova. Pull yourselves out of your homes or your tents and go out to the battlefield. And that's what the pasuk means. So I'll read to you the pasuk. It says, "Vaydaber Moshe es ha'am b'midbar lamed aleph. Vaydaber Moshe la'am leimor hicholtzu b'yitchem anoshim letzava v'yu al midjan laseis nikmas Hashem b'midjan." Pull them out of their homes. Take them out to the battlefield. So now the Gemara says, impossible. That can't be the pshat because I have a pasuk in Tehillim. Vaksiv, and the pasuk says in Tehillim, Yechaletz ani be'anyo, which means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu yizarzenu v'yitein la'ani koach be'anyo, anyo meaning in his poverty, v'imkein yachlotz pirusho lizares. It cannot mean pull him out of the house because Yechalis Ani Ba'anyo means that God is going to inspire the poor people and give them extra power. And that's called Zirus. So now we're still back to our problem. How do we know that v'cholza nalo me'al raglo means that she pulls his shoe off? Maybe it means she puts his shoe back on. So the Gemara answers, certainly chalatz means to take off, to pull it off. So what does it mean when it says Yechaletz ani be'anyo, bischar anyo? In other words, the destitute has been suffering during his life as an atonement for sin, and now we should be rewarding him for all his suffering. Bischar anyo. And what's going to happen as a reward to the ani? Yechalzo midina shel gehenim. God will pull him out of the judgment to the bad place. He suffered enough in this world. He has achieved atonement for his sins. There's no need to send him to that hot place over there called Gehenna. And that's called Yechaltzu. Yechaletz ani b'anyo. God will extricate the ani from his distress and from the judgment for Gehenna. So now the Gemara quotes a different pasuk. This is a pasuk in Yeshaya Hanavi. I'll read to you the whole pasuk. Chonem malach Hashem tzaviv lirav el chatzev. Actually, the Gemara quotes the entire pasuk. So I made a mistake. This pasuk that we're quoting now is a pasuk in Tehillim, and the previous pasuk was a pasuk in Iyov. What does it say in this pasuk? The malach is going to be mezares Yereah, those who are God-fearing Jews. And he'll give them strength. So once again, we see that Vayechaltem does not mean to pull somebody out, but rather lizares, to inspire them and energize them. which would mean in the case of chalitza that she should be putting his shoe back on instead of taking it off. And the Gemara answers, "B'schar yireav yechaltzem." Once again, yechaltzem means to pull them out of the din of Gehenna. Elohad ichsiv. What do we do with the pasuk with regard to the brachos that God bestows upon the poor people to try to strengthen them and pacify them? It says, "V'atzmosecha yachalitz," and this is a pasuk in Yeshaya. V'atzmosecha yachalitz. Now let's see a literal translation of this pasuk in Yeshaya. And your bones he will strengthen. Strengthen, again, it's zirus. It's not mishlav shalif, but rather zirus. The Amar Rabbi Lazar, zo hama'ula shebebrachos. In other words, in that pasuk in Yeshaya, there are no less than 11 brachos that I mentioned. It's a long, long pasuk. And the greatest and most superior of all the brachos, all 11, is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, "Hatzmotzecha yachalitz." He's like giving something to the ani, to the poor person. And once again, it would seem that the meaning of this bracha is to inspire and to energize. The Amar Rava, what's so superior about this bracha? Zeruze Garmin. You see explicitly the word zerus. So the word yachalitz does not refer to pulling something off, but rather to be mizares, garme. Garme means the bones of a person. So once again, how do we know that the pasuk v'cholza nalo me'al raglav means that she should remove his shoe? Maybe it means she should put the shoe on his foot, and that would be zerus. And the Gemara answers, I will prove to you that v'cholza mashma hachi, it means shlifa, to remove. But at the same time, I have to admit, mashma hachi, it has another meaning, and this is typical. We have many, many words that have double meanings. It also means ziruze. The hacha. But with regard to chalitza, we have a logical, compelling reason why we assume it means that she pulls off his shoe rather than putting it back on. Because Isal kedai ziruzehu imkain lichav rachman v'cholza nalo biraglo. And the word biraglo would mean that she should put his shoe on his foot. But it says me'al raglo, from his foot, not on his foot, but from his foot. So from his foot, the intention of the pasuk is that she should remove shoe from his foot. So the Gemara says, "I kasar rachmana biraglo." You want to suggest that the Torah could have written biraglo to indicate that she puts the shoe back on his foot. Hava mina. We would have come to the conclusion that biraglo in bishoko lo. And now we're talking about the case of, what's the word in English for somebody who whose leg was amputated. We'll call it an amputee. If you have a better word, let me know. So there's chalitza in the case of a person who the Yovam Baruch Hashem has a leg, but if he's never an amputee, which is called kita raglo, then he ties his shoe on the upper part of his thigh, what we might call it a stump. Bishoko is low. Low means there would not be chalitza, because the pasuk says biragla, and he doesn't have biragla; he has bishoko. Therefore, kosav rachmana v'chol me'al ragla, to teach me that afilu bishoko, that in a case of an amputee, you can fulfill chalitza with his shok. But again, we still are insisting, despite the pasuk may al raglo, that means that she places his shoe back on. And al raglo is telling me even onto the stump of an amputee. So we still are stuck. We don't know what gives us the license to interpret v'cholza nala me'araglo. That means she removes his shoe. Our answers him came lichto rachmana b'ma'al raglo. B'ma'al raglo means high up on his leg. In this case, an amputee on the shok. And we will derive from this that even in the case of an amputee, there's chalitza. So that would have been me'al raglo. My me'al raglo. I'm sorry, that would have been ma'al raglo. But what is me'al raglo? Shma mina mishlafu. That she pulls off his shoe. So wait a minute, I'm trying to figure out, according to the Gemara, what is the final conclusion about an amputee? Do we know? Just 1 second. Not sure. The Masechet has disappointed me. I'm missing something. Let me just read one footnote here. He says, "V'lo magia kol pasuk kolomar shechalitzi shlifa mipnei shahaya maspik lichtov meiraglo umizeh shekasav me'al raglo." Magia lahachshir gam hashok. I get is that an amputee does have chalitza from the shok. Oh, let's look for a second at Tosas Dimaskel Mai. The Imtomar Va'itzrich Me'al Lahachshir Shok L'Chalitza Yeshlom Adim Kain Havi Motzi L'Michtav Me'raglo Me'al Raglo Shvami Notar. So Tosas clearly says that we derive two conclusions from this pasuk. of Me'al Raglo. Number one, that she pulls off the shoe rather than putting it back on. And number two, that it can be taken from the shot in the case of an amputee. Now we have a small agadata. Amaleahu mina, you know that the minim were the early Christians, the heretics that tried to, in any way they possibly could, undermine the respect, the authority for the Torah. And in this case, the mina is engaging Rama Gamliel. Ama de cholitzle mare mine. Mare, the master, is a reference to the master of the universe. And the min is saying that the master of the universe has rejected the people of Israel, chas v'shalom, and he was cholitz. There was a chalitza. Dichsiv, and I'll prove it to you. It's interesting how the devil quotes scriptures. And this is a poskin Oshea Navi. It says, "Bitzonam ubibkaram yelchu levakeshes Hashem v'lo yimtu." The people are going to look and seek for God, and they won't find Him. That's what Oshea Navi prophesies. And the end of the pasuk says, "Cholatz mehem," meaning the way the min interpreted it, he, with the capital H, gave them chalitza, basically rejecting him. So Amalei, Rabbi Gamliel responds, Shote, Miksiv chalatz lahem, that he gave them chalitza, chalatz mehem ksiv, from them. What it means by from them is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the Yavam and Knesset Yisrael is the Yavama. And when the Yavama takes the shoe off the foot of the Yavam, she is rejecting the Yavam. And she severs the Zika to the Yavam. And the Navi is saying that HaKadosh Baruch Hu feels like a Yavam who is rejected by the Yavama because Knesset Yisrael has gotten to the point where they are rejecting God, chas v'shalom, through their misdeeds. Ve'ilu Yavama decholtzu mina achim midei mishasha ispe. What happens in a case where a Yavama wants to break up the Zika, and on her own initiative, she decides to pull off his shoe? Does it have any meaning to it, any validity? And therefore, even though Knesset Yisrael has gone astray and, so to speak, rejected and severed the bond with HaKadosh Baruch Hu by doing a chalitza, nevertheless, that chalitza is not valid. And therefore, the bris and the covenant, the relationship between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Knesset Yisrael, that bond is still very much intact. And as you know, theological arguments from the Christians always against the Jews are about the fact that God, chas v'shalom, has rejected the Jewish people. They may have once been the chosen people, but now they, the Christians, have replaced them. And this is another example of that general theological line of reasoning. Now we get back to the Gemara itself. The Mishnah says, "Ba'an pilya chalitzasa psula." And Anpili, we said, was socks that he wears on his feet. And she pulled off his sock, but not his shoe. He was barefoot, but he had socks on. That's not a valid chalitza. So the Gemara says, Lememra, does this imply the Anpilia, when you have a shoe that's made of cloth, like the stockings, lav minolhu, it does not qualify as a minol, it's possible a chalitza. And we will bring support to this from another Mishnah in Masechet Shkalim. Utna nami, with regard to Trumas Halishka, it says, Ein hagizbar torem es halishka nichnas litrom lo v'fargod chafus v'lo v'anpilya he ain't torach lomar the minol v'sandal v'tisha ein nichnasim v'minol v'sandal lazar. So now the Gizbar, who's in charge of the monies, he supervises the monies of the Shkalim. And in order to do the Trumas Halishka and to designate certain funds for Karbanas Tzibur, etc., then he's not allowed to enter in with an Anpilia, which is a shoes that are made of cloth, and the reason for this is because of a pasuk in the Torah that says v'yisev nekiyim me'Hashemu miYisrael. A Jew has to always act in a way that's beyond suspicion. And it seems that it was quite common back in the day to hide money in one's stockings. And I think there are people who still do this today. If you ever see somebody wear stockings and they're bulging at some point, you know there's money in them. So the Gizbar, when he enters into the Trumas Halishka, he should be careful not to come in with his stockings, because the spectator might suspect that he's going to embezzle some money and hide it in his stockings. Now, as far as wearing shoes, because until that we're discussing someone who's barefoot walking in stockings, but to enter into the Torah, to be Torah Delishka with shoes on, that's impossible. This has nothing to do with Trumas Halishka, the fact that he's going in for the Shkalim, but as a general rule, he's not allowed, and no one's allowed to go into the Azara wearing shoes. And this, by the way, is derived from a pasuk mibi keish zosmi etchem remos chatzerai, that you're not allowed to enter with min olim into the chatzah. The chatzah is a reference to the azara. But it's clear from this Mishnah that Anfilia is not included on the minah. And therefore you'd be allowed to enter into the azara with Anfilia, except for the Trumas Halishka, where there's a suspicion that he might be stealing money. So the Brisa therefore has to tell me that you're not allowed to wear stockings when you're going in as a gizbar to be Torah the Lishka. And we ask a contradiction from a Brisa with regard to Yom HaKippurim, which is a day in which we are enjoined from wearing sandal. Echad mino v'sandal vanpilia lo yitayel behem lo mibayis lebayis v'lo mimito lemita. You should not be wearing shoes, and for that matter, stockings, when you go from your house to another house, or even within the house, when you go from one room to another room, from one bedroom to another bedroom. And here the Brisa says you're not allowed to wear anfilia on Yom Kippur. It must mean that anfilia is included in the Isser of Nilas HaSandal, and it's called a minnow. Omar Abaye answers, no, anfilia is not a minnow. You're not allowed to wear it on Yom Kippur. That's anfilia de ispe ksise, umishum tainu. These weren't just regular stockings that you were not allowed to wear on Yom Kippur, but rather they were pieces of cotton or wool or leather that were very soft. When he ties them around his shoe, because of the softness of it, he gets tainug. He enjoys the protection of this very soft leather or wool. And you're not allowed to wear this on Yom Kippur, on your feet, even if it's not a minnow, but rather it's anfilia. So Rava objects. He says, "Humbly, Rava, the mishum tainug, the low minnow b'yom kippur yasiri." Are you telling me that I'm not allowed to wear anything on my feet that's pleasurable, even though it's not a minnow? For Rava bar Avhuna, korich sudra kare, on Yom Kippur, he used to tie his feet with a beged. Sudra means a beged, like a kerchief, v'nafak. And he went out into the public domain wearing these kerchiefs, very comfortable kerchiefs around his feet. So you see that this is not called a minnow, and therefore it's not included in the Isser of Yom Kippurim. So how could you, Abai, tell me that anfilia, even though it's not a minnow, is also on Yom Kippur mishum tainug? There's no Isser of tainug on Yom Kippur. And therefore, we go back to our original premise and our proof that anfilia is included on the minnow, and that's why it's prohibited as footwear on Yom Kippur. And then once again, we're stuck with our contradiction to the Mishnah and the Brisa that says that when the Gizbar goes in to be Tormes Halishka, then the only reason he cannot wear anfilia is because he'll be suspect of embezzling funds. But it's not the same as minol and sandal, which are also, even if he's not going in for Trumas Halishka. Elamarava, that which is tainug, if it's not a minol, it's mutter. And that's what we proved from Rabbi Barafuna, who would tie around his feet a bad, a beged, that would give him pleasure. If that be the case, what do we do with the contradiction tab Mishnah and Trumas Halishka, where we saw clearly that anfilia is not considered a minol? And yet on Yom Kippur it's asur. So it's considered a minol. So we now again have a contradiction. What is the status of anfilia? Is it a minol or is it not? We saw that with regard to Yom Kippur, Rav insists that it is considered a minol. But on the other hand, from the Mishnah and Shkolim regarding the Trumas Halishka, we came to the conclusion that anfilia is not a minol. Again, it's also for another reason, but not because he's entering into the Azor with shoes on. So why is it also on Yom Kippur? Lo kasha, says the Gemara, I can reconcile this contradiction. kan banfilia shel or, kan banfilia shel beged. The word anfilia is a kind of generic term for anything that's very soft and is very pleasurable to wear on the feet. It might be made of or, it might not be made of or. It might be made of cloth, it might not be made of cloth. With regard to Yom Kippur, what kind of anfilia that you wear on your feet is prohibited? That's anfilia shel or. And that's included in the general, or shall I say, the all umbrella encompassing term minnow. And why is it called a minnow? Because it's made of or. And why is it also on Yom Kippur to wear this anfilia? Because it's made of or. But kan, with regard to the Gizbar and the Trumas Halishka, we saw that anfilia is not called a minnow. And so too with regard to chalitza, we came to the conclusion it's not valid for chalitza. That's banfilia shel beged. That's the anfilia that we were describing earlier, a cloth that he uses to wrap around his feet. And that's not considered minnow. So if you see that anfilia is considered minnow, like for example, with regard to Yom Kippurim, you'll have to realize that we talk about an anfilia shel or. But if on the other hand, you talk about anfilia, which is not qualified as a minnow, then you're talking about anfilia shel beged. Hachinami Mistaber, says the Gemara, that we should make this distinction of Rava between the Brisa of Yom Kippurim and the Mishnah of Chalitza. The Ilo Tema Hachi Kashi Yom Kippurim Tanya Lo Yitayel Odam Bikur Dekasian Bitoch Beisav and Matayel Huban Filim Bitoch Beisav. Although he's not allowed to wear these very small and precise shoes that are made of leather, and he translates Kurdikesin as min olim dakim mi or, very thin leather, very probably high quality leather. Shenolim mitachas limin olim. If you have min olim and they're very thick, and you want to cushion them, you use this as a cushion, and it really protects your foot. And that's also on Yom Kippur because it's made of or and it's a real minnow. And therefore he's not allowed to wear these kundra kasin even in his house on Yom Kippur. But as far as anfilian is concerned, he's allowed to be metayel with anfilian on Yom Kippur. Exactly why it says b'toch beso, we'll have to see. Elav shmamino kan banfilu shel or kan banfilu shel beged shmamino. So, with regard to this brisa that permits wearing anfilin, at least b'toch beso, on Yom Kippur, that brisa is talking about anfilia shel beged. Anya Kavase de Rava will bring a brisa to substantiate this distinction between two categories of anfilia. One is made of or, one is made of beged. And for chalitza, we need a minnow. It's got to be made of or. And if it's made of beged, it is not a nal as far as chalitza. The brisa says cholza b'minnow nifram. So he's got a ripped shoe. Shechofer esrov raglo. Okay, we'll have to get back to all these cases. Oh, sandal and nifchas. Shemekabel is rov regel, sandal shel sham v'shel siv, b'kav hakitea, b'muk b'smichas haraglayim, b'anfilia shel or. So amongst the various categories of min'olim, which are valid for chalitza, we have on the list anfilia shel or. Again, all the other cases on the list we have to go through one by one. But what we're interested in is the last case here, namely anfilia shel or. And this is a clear-cut proof to substantiate Rabba's his ruling that anfilia shel or is considered a minhal and is kosher for chalitza. Obviously, it's prohibited on Yom Kippurim. And the Brisa goes on, and we'll talk about that a little bit later.